أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم سبحانك اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وعنده مفاتح الغيب لا يعلمها إلا هو ويعلم ما في البر والبحر وما تسقط من ورقة إلا يعلمها ولا حبة في ظلمات الأرض ولا رطب ولا يابس إلا في كتاب مبين. Inshallah, today we're going to enter into the heart of the subject, and we're going to talk about the first two examples or first two models of prophetic coexistence. We'll talk about the Meccan period, and we'll talk about the period in which some of the companions went to Ethiopia, Abyssinia. So this will be a little bit more condensed, hopefully, than the last time. And before we conclude, I want to just touch on two topics that sort of, I think, stem from this that are causing a lot of maybe commotion and debate today. I want to talk about slavery, and I want to talk about apostasy/disbelief sort of as the end. So in the first model, or the first period, or the first example of coexistence from the prophetic model, this is the model of Mecca. And in Mecca, there were two halves to the story. There was the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, before he was commissioned, and there was a life of the Prophet ﷺ after he was commissioned, before the community, the majority of the community went to Medina. So what was life like before he was commissioned as a prophet? Because the Prophet ﷺ was from Mecca, so he was born there, raised there, and he lived the majority of his life in Mecca until he was commissioned with prophethood at the age 40, and then he lived in Mecca for an additional 13 years, so he left Mecca when he was 53 to live out the rest of his life, the last 10 years of his life in Medina. So the majority of the Prophet's life ﷺ was in Mecca. And I think this is very important because, as I said last time, a lot of times when we think about the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, when we think about the prophetic example, for some reason our minds go to the last phase of his life, the last phase of the Medina life. But the majority of his life was before that. And as a matter of fact, the majority of his life was before he was even commissioned as a prophet ﷺ. But as I mentioned before, his entirety of his life and his sayings and his being and his everything about him is an example for us. So, what was life like in Mecca before the Prophet ﷺ was commissioned? We have a very interesting text from Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, who was a relative of the Prophet ﷺ, who says later, when we get to the Abyssinia period, this is part of his speech when he speaks with the Najashi of Ethiopia. He says that Mecca is a place where the strong eat the weak. If you're weak financially, if you're weak racially, so there was prejudice against non-Arabs, there was prejudice against blacks, so if you were black or you were a slave or something like that, if you were without family or without lineage, the strong would eat the weak. So it was a place in which people didn't really have their rights protected, really didn't have the rights guaranteed. There was rampant usury, and usury, we need to understand, is not interest. It's another topic altogether, but for our purposes, I flag that it's important to understand that usury is not bank interest. Usury is where someone is crushed with the inability to pay a loan that just keeps increasing exponentially, and you're in a pit of debt. And people would use this loan shark type of usury transaction to crumble people and to crumble families. The moral paradigm was upside down. So morality was not necessarily based on the absolute, or was not based on some clear code of ethics, but it was based on, a type of pagan polytheism. So, for example, one of the outcomes of this was that people would prize male children over female children, to the point that some of the families would even bury their female children alive, because they would bring shame to the family. If the firstborn wasn't, a male child, then they would literally bury that child alive. And the Quran talks about this. وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. On the day of judgment, the child, the girl child that was buried alive, will testify, and she will ask, well, by what right was I killed? So, and on the religious side, there was polytheism, where they worshipped, 300 or 360 idols. There are different narrations, but basically there was a god or an idol for every day of the year. And these idols were placed both inside the Kaaba and outside the Kaaba. So this is how Ja'far ibn Abi Talib described the time of Mecca. He was painting a true picture, but he was trying to allude to the fact that it was not a good thing. It was good for people who had, the upper hand, but for the majority of people it wasn't fair. Until the Prophet ﷺ came and he tried to upset that sort of status quo and try to right some of these wrongs. So it was in this environment that the Prophet ﷺ grew up. It was in this environment of polytheism, of a type of patriarchy that would lead to death of innocence, so on and so forth. This was the environment that he grew up in, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in that he coexisted. So in that model he lived. So he continued to trade with people. He continued to do things that would help society. And his wife Khadija radiallahu anha, when he was first commissioned with the message, and it was a heavy burden, and he came to her, she said, well, you're a good person. And then she listed some of the things that he did in this time period. So she said, you're honest. So he was known as al-Sadiq al-Amin. Even though people were not honest, he was honest in his dealings, in his transactions. And she said, you are charitable. You give money to the poor. You give money to those who need it. Because in that type of society, people that were needy had nothing. There were no, foundations or no charities or no hospitals or orphanages. They were just sort of left to be, the wind. But the Prophet ﷺ was charitable. He would give from what he had, from his own wealth, whether it was little or whether it was vast, to help. And she said that you honor your guests. So obviously these are guests that they could either be relatives or polytheists or disbelievers, so on and so forth. He honored anybody who came to him. He honored his wife's family. He honored the youth. And that you help in the general good matters. And this is a reference to this treaty that the Prophet ﷺ was a part of. And all of the tribes in Mecca, again, all of this we're talking about before he was commissioned as a prophet. All of the tribes, they came together and they said, look, let's enter this pact and let's come, basically we're going to pass a piece of legislation in our language, that anybody who comes into Mecca, we are going to guarantee the rights. Really talking about financial rights. We're going to make sure that no one is wronged. We're going to make sure that anybody who comes to Mecca is dealt equally and fairly. And this was called Hilf al-Fudul, the oath of Fudul. And the Prophet ﷺ acted on this. So it's not just something that he was like, okay, sign me up. He actually acted on it. So one man came to Mecca, and he was going around the Kaaba, and he was calling to all of the people who looked like they were somebody important, and they're like, I was wronged, who's going to fix my wrong? Until he came to the Prophet ﷺ, who was sitting with some of his friends, and the Prophet ﷺ said, what's wrong? He said, this man hurt me with my camel sale. He prevented the sale of my camel. He inflated the prices on me. Now no one will buy the camels from me. So who is this person? Abu Jahl, who is an uncle of the Prophet ﷺ. So he went ﷺ to Abu Jahl. First he went to the man. He fixed the problem. He sold the camels. And one of the sales, he gave all of the proceeds to widows. And then he went to Abu Jahl. And he said, never do that again. And Abu Jahl was scared. And some of the narrations, they say, when the other people of Quraysh asked him, why did you capitulate so easily to the Prophet ﷺ? He said, well, didn't you see those two people on his right that had spears? An allusion to that the Prophet ﷺ had went and angels were manifest, and he instilled fear in Abu Jahl. And he said, I had to, they were going to kill me. But no one else saw that except him. But anyway, the point being that the Prophet ﷺ acted on this treaty. And he said, after he was commissioned, he said, I was called to a treaty in the time before Islam, where I called to it again, I would engage in it. Meaning this treaty. So the Prophet ﷺ did things that would help the community, would help the society. And the most important thing is that even before his commissioning, there was still this honor of the Kaaba. There was still this honor that the Kaaba was a sacred place. And he would continue to do, tawaf. He would circumambulate around the Kaaba in some sort of worship and contemplation, not of the false gods, of course, because the Prophet ﷺ never did that. And at the same time, he would seclude himself. Once a year or so, he would withdraw himself to contemplate. But the point being is, when you look at this period of time before he was commissioned, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he lived in that community as a member of that community. But he didn't necessarily let this community swallow him. So there were things that were wrong with that community. He didn't condone those things. He tried to fix them. But he also traded with them, interacted with them, kept his family ties. He didn't cut anyone else off because they were worshiping these false idols that he didn't believe in, again before he was commissioned. But he kept these type of relations, even to the point in which there was a economic, let's say, downtime in Mecca. The Prophet ﷺ went to his uncle because he had too many kids, and he said, I will take Ali from you, who was just a boy at the time, and I will raise him in my own house, because at that time there was not enough resources for somebody with a large family to take care of all of these children. So many of these larger families that were dishing out kids to relatives, maybe somebody doesn't have a child, you take two, you take one, and until we can get things back on the road, on the right foot again. So the Prophet ﷺ volunteered, and he took Imam Ali alayhi salam. And this is one of the secrets that in Allah's guiding way, that Imam Ali alayhi salam grew up in the house of the Prophet ﷺ. And Imam Ali alayhi salam was the first from amongst the youth to become Muslim. After Khadija, so Khadija became Muslim from the women. She was the first to believe. And then the first man to believe was Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiyallahu anhu. And then the first amongst the youth was Imam Ali alayhi salam. So the Prophet ﷺ took in his uncle's son, his cousin, because the family was in need. So this was the type of person that he was before he was commissioned. And this is how he coexisted sort of in this environment. So maybe now is a good place to pause to pray, because then we'll sort of shift now to talk about how he was in Mecca after he was commissioned. Okay, Bismillah. So before the break, we talked about Mecca in general, and how the Prophet ﷺ lived or coexisted in that environment before he was commissioned. So after he was commissioned as a prophet, ﷺ, which happened roughly when he was 40 years old, obviously Mecca now remained the same. But the only difference is now that the Prophet ﷺ is sort of who we normally think of him as a messenger from God, having a message, so on and so forth. So how did this change? Now, the presence of the Prophet ﷺ and his call, obviously people, the Meccans, they didn't like that, because he was upsetting the status quo, he was upsetting norms and things like that. And they tried very much, with everything that they could do, they tried to do away with him. And they tried to do away with the Muslims. So he continued his family ties, he continued trading, doing business, and the people that followed him, the early Muslim community, same thing. Not everyone in their family was Muslim. They continued to have polytheists or pagans or whatever in their families. They can maintain those family ties. They continue to do business with the community, so on and so forth. But it was the Meccans that didn't tolerate the Muslims. So it was the other way around. So the lack of wanting to coexist or the lack of sort of getting along was the other way. And this put an extreme amount of pressure on the Prophet ﷺ and on the early Muslim community, to the point that at one point in time, the Muslims were physically removed from the precincts of Mecca and sort of pushed out, and there was an embargo, an economic embargo against the Muslims imposed by the Meccans. So there was no trade, no food supplies, to the point that some of the companions, they said we had to eat the leaves from the trees. And Sayyidah Khadija, Lady Khadija radiallahu anha, she was 60 at the time. She had to leave her home, and Lady Khadija was from a very well-known family. She was a very successful business lady, but because of their beliefs and the persecution of the Meccans, because of their beliefs, she left her home and she went with the community, and it was very tough, and this lasted for about 3 years. And it was during this time that some of the companions went to Abyssinia, and we'll get to that in a second. So things were very tough. Things became very tough very fast for the Muslims after the Prophet ﷺ was commissioned. He himself, he was the source of ridicule, public humiliation, slander. People physically accosted him. He was praying one time in front of the Kaaba, and somebody dumped trash on him, and his daughter Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam removed the trash from him. At one time he was praying sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and somebody came and strangled him, put something over his neck and strangled him while he was praying. So this is the kind of, imagine the kind of persecution, it's like almost like World War II, like Nazi persecution. It was something like that, something that's close in our minds that we can sort of compare it to. People were persecuted only for their beliefs. Another one of the famous stories of persecution was Bilal. Bilal radiallahu anhu, who was African. He was a black African, and he was an early believer, but he was a slave. And his master at the time persecuted him, not because he was abusing his slave, but persecuting him because of his beliefs. In a very humiliating way, lying his body on the hot sand and putting, a boulder over him. And Bilal said, the companions, when they narrate the story, they say we would walk by Bilal and we would hear him, he would say, Ahadun ahad, Ahadun ahad, Ahadun ahad, which is one. And later they asked him, why would you say that? He said, this was the thing that pissed them off the most. Maybe he didn't use that language, but he said, this is the thing that made them upset the most. Anything I said was not as upsetting to them as me reiterating that. So, even though he was in this persecuted state, he held on to his beliefs, and he said that which upset them more. And at this moment, Abu Bakr, he came to the slave master and he said, why are you doing this to the slave? I'll trade you. I have a slave boy who's of your religion, and I'll take Bilal. And they swapped, and then Abu Bakr set Bilal free. So, and that's why I wanted to talk about slavery in a little bit, because of this story. One of the companions, one of the first, Yasir, the first companion to be martyred in Islam, she was killed for refusing to curse the Prophet ﷺ. So this is the type of persecution that they wanted them to publicly renounce their faith. They wanted them to publicly curse the Prophet ﷺ. However, despite all of this, in those 13 years, the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslim community were patient. And when Yasir was killed, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Sabran ya ala Yasir fa inna maw'idukum al-jannah. O patience, the family of Yasir, your promise is paradise. And this became, and until this day, it's a common used phrase of patience in the face of perseverance. So one of the things that we deduce, or that we benefit from this time period, is that the Muslims' attitude in the face of persecution, in the face of pressure, is patience. This is very important, because this is, in many respects, counter to sort of the predominant culture. In the dominant culture, whether it's not just a Western culture, I'm just saying in our modern culture, we don't have any patience. If the elevator is not open, if the button of the elevator does not immediately open the door of the elevator, it's just too long. Forget waiting 5 seconds, it's just too long. To the point where people can complain, or if the elevator stops at every floor, people, everyone looks at the guy that pressed 1 like, you could have taken the steps, for 1 and 2, you could have taken the steps. But we have no patience. This is nothing compared to life tribulations. These people, their wealth was taken away from them. They were tradesmen, they were businessmen. All of their wealth was taken away, their trade routes were taken away. They lost all of their money. They lost their honor, or not their honor, but they lost their status in society because of their beliefs. They were like pariahs in the Meccan society. But the Prophet ﷺ was patient, and he ordered patience. And this is a virtue that we really need to think about. Not because we're persecuted. We're not persecuted at all. The elevator not opening is not persecution. We're not persecuted. And just because people say bad things about Muslims, if Muslims stopped doing stupid things, then they would stop saying bad things about us. So that's another issue altogether. We're not persecuted. But we could use a lot more patience. And part of patience, we have to understand, is that there's a divine wisdom in patience, and there's a spiritual benefit in patience, that Allah Ta'ala has placed us in that difficulty. Allah Ta'ala could have made the Prophet ﷺ a prophet king, the way He made Solomon or David. He could have made the Prophet ﷺ have all of this worldly power. And he was so disruptive that the Meccans actually offered him that. They said, we will make you a king. We will crown you a king if you just please stop saying what you're saying. And he said his famous statement, if they put the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left hand, I would not leave this mission, not leave this calling. So he didn't do this for some worldly power, because oftentimes to stand out and say what is right is to incur a lot of heat, is to incur a lot of blame. And even though people get so happy and excited about what you're saying, when the what hits the fan, you're all left alone. Even the people that you thought were with you. So tribulation is something that's divine. Who put this tribulation in front of us? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is what we call the destiny. When the Prophet ﷺ said faith is to believe in destiny, it's good and it's bad, means that it's not always going to be peaches, it's not always going to be roses. There are going to be difficulties. وَلَنَبَلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ. Allah Ta'ala says, and we will try you by a loss of wealth, a loss of family, and we will diminish these things and give glad tidings to those who are patient. So tribulation for us equals patience. Now, it's not just family tribulations or personal tribulations like, my uncle's got cancer. We're just, inshallah, we're going to be patient. It's not just that, but even everything around us. See, these were not people that had cancer or, somebody got lost in battle or something like that, didn't come home from the war. This is, the whole community is being persecuted, meaning the system is against them on purpose because they are Muslim. And they were still patient. The Prophet ﷺ never once, called for arms to fight. Because he would say, when they would ask him, shouldn't we do something? He said, I wasn't asked to do that. Allah didn't ask me to do that. Allah didn't ask me to form a revolution and take over Mecca. He told me to teach you how to pray. He told me to teach you how to fast. He told me to teach you how to be just with the people that you work with your family, so on and so forth. Patience, patience, patience. And we benefit from this. Most of what we see in the Muslim world today, this is part of the problem. It's a lack of patience. It's this idea that we're going to take matters into our own hands and we're going to bring the change now. And then look at the Muslim world 3-4 years later, 5 years later, it's an absolute disarray. Worse than it was ever before. I mean, if before we thought it was bad, now it's considered like paradise compared to what it is now. Because of this idea of patience, because of this idea that I have to do it myself now. But Allah Ta'ala, He says, يُؤْتِ الْمُلْكَ مَنْ يَشَاءُ وَيَنْزَعُ الْمُلْكَ مِمَّنْ يَشَاءُ. Allah gives dominion to whom He wants, but He takes away the dominion from whom He wants. He snatches it away from whom He wants. بِيَدِهِ الْخَيْرُ. Because Allah is Malikul Mulk. Allah is the one that is the possessor of the dominions, not us. So when you find something, it doesn't mean that you sort of like just lie down and, woe is me. No, they tried their best to do what they needed to do. But overall, the Prophet ﷺ was patient. And he coexisted with them. And this is the most important thing. The second thing I want to say before we switch to the other mode is that the Prophet ﷺ never cut his ties with the Kaaba, even though it was surrounded and filled with 360 idols. That lasted until the 8th year of the Hijrah. And this is very, very important, because the Prophet ﷺ was not a dim-witted person. He wasn't offended or scared by the idols. He was offended from a spiritual point because they're false idols. And he was calling to monotheism. But he wasn't threatened. He didn't see them and blow them up. He coexisted with them until the 8th year of the Hijrah. That's 2 years before he died, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He faced the Kaaba and he prayed. And he did tawaf around the Kaaba, even though there were idols there. And this tells us a lot about the difference between correct religion and literalism. If I say to you, let's hit the road, all of you would be like, okay, we're going to go out and we're going to start our journey. But if I said, let's hit the road, and one of us went out and started hitting the road with their shoe, there's something deficient. You all giggle. There's something deficient in that understanding. But many people, they understand Islam that way, in that literal, ridiculous way. So there is a right way to understand things and put things in context and understand our surroundings, and then there's a wrong way. And that's one of the points of why we're doing is there's a right Islam and there's a wrong Islam, full stop. We don't have to beat around the bush. So the Prophet ﷺ coexisted with this mode. Now, in the middle of all of this, as I said, the Muslims were persecuted. It was very difficult. So the Prophet ﷺ at one point, he said, okay, in the 5th year of his prophecy, or his commissioning, so he lived in Mecca for 13 years as a prophet. So after 5 years, he told the Muslims, there is a good king in a good country, or kingdom. Country is our language, kingdom. Go to him, because nobody is treated unjustly there. Nobody is treated wrongly there. And he sent the companions, and some of the male companions, the female companions, some of the children, to Abyssinia, which then was called Abyssinia, which is now Ethiopia. And this was, ironically, in the month of Rajab, the month that we're in now, which is one of the 4 sacred months of Islam. We have 4 sacred months. 3 of them are next to each other, ul-Qatl, ul-Hijjah, and Muharram, the 11th, 12th, and 1st month. And then there's Rajab all by itself, the 4th of the sacred months. So in year 5 of the 5 before the Hijrah, you can say, in the month of Rajab, the Prophet ﷺ sent the companions and Ja'far ibn Abi Talib with them to Ethiopia. This model is perhaps the most model that we will identify with. And now, as I said in the beginning, the goal is not to find like which one we fit in. The goal is to take from all of it and benefit from all of it together for our predicament, our modern predicament. But of all of the examples that we have, this is the shortest, but yet the most one that makes sense for our predicament. And unfortunately, at the same time, the one that the ulama in the past least talked about. And I'll address that in a little bit. When they went, they were 11 men and 4 women. They stayed Rajab, Sha'ban, and Ramadan. And then they came back for a little bit, and things were so good, they asked the Prophet ﷺ if they could go back again. And then they went back again for a second time. At that time, there were about 90, okay? 90 companions, men, women, and children. Some of them were born there, living as a religious protected minority in this Christian kingdom. When they arrived there, Ja'far, he goes and he addresses the Najashi in a very long thing. He says 3 main points. The first point we already talked about in my beginning remarks, what life was like in Mecca. So he said, look, things were bad. God sent us this prophet. He's light upon light, and they just won't leave us alone. So he explained to him what was wrong. The second thing is from his own volition. He explained to him, he said, what is this man you claim is a prophet, what does he say? He doesn't say, he says you have to stand in the sink and make wudu and clean your feet, or some of these oddities that people think are odd. For us, it's like that's what we do. But the outside world, I hate to be the one to break it to you, they find this is very odd. If you walked into a bathroom and saw someone standing in the sink, you would be really concerned. Yourself, even if they were Muslim, you're like, whoa, what was that? He didn't begin by saying those things. He began by saying what the Prophet ﷺ taught them about Christ ﷺ. And he began reciting the chapter of Mary. Why did he do that? Because he's smart. He is trying to make this foreigner understand that what he believes, what the Prophet ﷺ taught him, is the same thing that he believes, is the same thing that that nation is built on. It's based on the same thing. And that's why after he finished reciting the Najashi, he said, what Christ brought and what your Prophet brought came from the same source. Meaning he tried to make him understand that they had the same values, that they had the same principles. People, they think, oh, he said that because, he wanted him to convert and he was making da'wah. It's the last thing on his mind. He's fleeing for his life. And unfortunately, the Quraysh came with them. They were on the pursuit. They wouldn't leave them alone. And this leads to the third point. So the next day, the Quraysh, they're like, no, they're lying. Ask them what they really say about Christ. But Ja'far, he was honest. He said, we say that Christ is the son of Mary, a prophet, a great prophet. No prophet between Christ and Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ in the Islamic belief. But he was a man, and he was honest, so he didn't lie about it. He didn't say, well, he's special and, he's... He was honest. He was honest when he was asked an honest question. And because of that, the Najashi protected them and maintained the right to assemble and the right to worship. This idea, we're all honest inshallah, so that we get. But this idea of shared values is very important. People want others to believe that Islam does not share the values of the modern world, does not share the values of democracy, does not share the values of the West, so on and so forth. And this is not true. This doesn't mean that everything is compatible, because democracy is something that sort of came together after a lot of fumbling since the 1700s till now. So it's relatively new. Islam has been around for a while. But Islam has the ability to adopt and promotes, as a matter of fact, many of these ideas of equality before the law, of freedom of belief, of freedom of expression, of the dignity of the human being, so on and so forth. These are our values, Islamic values, and there are values, whether we're American or we're British or French or whatever, there are values as well. And that's how we need to present ourselves. Not because it's some sort of like ploy or duplicity, because this is actually what we believe in. And these values upon which this society is founded are our values as well. Now we might differ on, some branches of or understandings or something like that. But the idea of participation in the system and the freedom to assemble the way we have, no one's outside, ready to gang us up for what we're saying. We are free to worship and assemble. And we believe in these type of principles that all men and women are created equal in the eyes of God. Maybe we all have different roles. I could never play in the NBA. I'm not going to say it's not fair. We all have our own human constraints, our own humanity, but we're all morally equal. So this is very important that we remember this as far as navigating our identities. That there is nothing wrong with our identities as Muslims and as modern people, or Muslims and Westerners, or Muslims and Americans, for example, or any other sort of Western nation. This is very important. The other thing is that they went to live as a religious minority. What did they do when they were there? Unfortunately, right after this incident, the Najashi's kingdom was attacked by a neighboring, person that meant the kingdom harm, that meant the nation harm. So there was a national security threat. There was a threat against the homeland. And the companions that were there, they said, this was the most time we were scared. Because if the Najashi fell, the whole reason we came would have been gone in the first. It will be even worse because we're foreigners and we're a religious minority. So what did they do? They participated in the battle with the Najashi against his enemy. And when the Najashi won, the Muslims, they said, this was the most time we were happy. The most joy we experienced was when Allah gave victory to the Najashi over his enemy. Because their homeland is one. So this is now their home. They are, at that time there is not this concept of citizenship the way we understand citizenship. But there was a concept of citizenship that once you go somewhere and you stay a certain amount of time, you are part of that land. Even in the books of fiqh, we have this idea. And because of this idea of being attributed to a place if you live there longer, this is how a lot of the ulama understood and accepted the concept of citizenship as it emerged in the modern nation state, which is another topic. So when I say that I use the concept of citizenship, I don't want people to think I'm like some reform modernist person just trying to reread. I'm just using a word that we understand. There's obviously differences, but the Muslims now are part of this homeland, part of this kingdom, part of this nation. And they fought when there was a threat against the homeland. And they celebrated, and even the companions, Zubayr ibn al-Awwam radiallahu anhu, he was decorated, a decorated war veteran, because the Najashi decorated him and honored him for his valor and his bravery in the battle. And he was given a spear as a gift, as a that was his medal at the time. And this spear was then given to the Prophet ﷺ, and he had it with him on like special occasions and on Eid day and things like that. And the Khulafa, they would carry this spear, and one Khalif would give it to the next Khalif after him, so on and so forth. So this was like an honored token of this time, that the spear that the Najashi gave to Zubayr for his valor in battle. And because of this, a lot of the fuqaha, and this comes to sort of just a small commentary on how some of the fuqaha or some of the ulama talk about this or don't talk about this in the past, is they say that it's permissible in this type of situation to fight, to participate in this battle if one is scared for one's life as a minority. But then some of them, they say, including Imam al-Shafi'i and others, are like, yeah, but really Najashi became Muslim, so he was Muslim, so they were fighting with the Muslims. And they had this like problem admitting that it was permissible to fight if one was living as a minority somewhere and one's homeland was attacked. And here we pause because somebody can come out and say, I'm making this up, or I'm disagreeing with all of these people. That the ulama of the past, they had a different perspective than our perspective. The ulama, the medieval jurists that write about this, when a lot of our legal literature was codified and things like that, they wrote from a perspective of strength, of political strength, of political hegemony. There was no idea that some Muslims will go into the yonder and live as a minority. And that's why they glossed over this period of the Abyssinian period, not because they didn't understand it or they didn't respect it or anything like that. There was no real utility at their time for talking endlessly the way we are now about it. Because the Muslim world was so big, was so strong, was so expansive. The idea that there was like a Muslim minority community in Europe or even across this big body of water, they didn't even know there was something there, was not even on their minds. And this reminds us that while we inherit our tradition, our intellectual tradition, and while we respect our intellectual tradition is open for criticism and is open for critique with certain parameters. So we're not here saying no one understood this except me. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is we benefit from it what we were meant to benefit from it. But like them, we need to apply our interpretive methodology to find the most compatible way to live our life as Muslims now. Because the books that we've inherited, that's exactly what Imam al-Shafi'i was doing. When he wrote his works, when he came up with these opinions, he was finding the most compatible way to become a Muslim at that time. And this is something that will never end. This charge for all of us never ends, that we have to constantly find how we can benefit from what the Prophet ﷺ left us, from what Allah Ta'ala tells us in the Qur'an, how we best take that and apply it to our current predicament. So this is a little bit about the Najashi. In conclusion, the Prophet ﷺ exchanged letters with him, exchanged presents with him. So this idea of ties and alliances, it will make more sense when we get to the Medina period we talk about next time. But this was also something that the Prophet ﷺ engaged in. He was inclined to peace. He was inclined to alliances rather than struggle and warfare. And this example of coexistence, I think, for us makes the most sense, because this is really what describes us. We are a religious minority, but we are citizens of this homeland. And as such, like the Muslims in Abyssinia, like the companions in Abyssinia, we care about this homeland. We are happy when something goes well. We are worried when there's a threat. And we stand and we fight when we are attacked. This is the attitude that we have to have, because this is the attitude of the Prophet ﷺ has left us, the attitude of the companions. And this is the only thing that really makes sense when you think about it. Also of interest note, before we talk about sort of those two topics, and I want to hear from you, is that after the Prophet ﷺ left Mecca to Medina, after he migrated himself, after the 10 years in Mecca as a prophet, many of the companions in Abyssinia remained, because that's how happy they were. They didn't go, all of them, to Medina. They remained, living as a religious minority. So this idea that we're like somehow sinning by living here and we have to go join the Islamic State, this is ridiculous. Because even from the early community, this was the attitude that they had, that things were so good for them, things were so comfortable for them, that they remained living there. Now just 2 points about slavery and about disbelief. A lot of times we find these, for our modern sensibilities, these difficult issues that we find in our history and in our past. And the reason I wanted to talk about these two topics is because they're very much now a topic of public discourse. So first I want to talk about disbelief. What is belief and what is disbelief? What we call in Arabic kufr, or disbelief. Disbelief, as understood by the ulama, is rejection of a central point of religion or something that has clearly been established of the religion on purpose, knowing that it is something that is central. So somebody that says, I don't believe that the Quran is the word of God, or I don't believe that the Prophet ﷺ was a prophet, Prophet Muhammad was a prophet. This is what we call disbelief. You believe in it or you don't believe in it. And the disbelief involves a rejection. And this is very important as we talk about this topic. An acceptance and a rejection. So belief and disbelief are descriptions. They're not proscriptions. They're descriptions. What does that mean? It describes the state of somebody. You describe somebody who accepts these things when you're inside wearing the lens of Islam, somebody who accepts these central religious tenets, you describe them as a believer. They believe in these things. If somebody rejects them, you describe them as a disbeliever. It's not something that's like you have the gun of belief and disbelief and you go around labeling people like, branding them believer and disbeliever. It's not like that. It's a description. And many things that are misunderstood in the modern age by, whether they be violent extremists or they be terrorists, come from this inability to make distinctions. But the mind of the jurist in Islam is a mind that makes distinctions. Is the verse that I'm reading general or is it specific? Is the Prophet ﷺ in this hadith talking about something general for all of us, or is he talking about something specific? So every letter, every word of the text means something to the person interpreting them. So the mind of the jurist is able, or the mind of the alim, the scholar of the religious sciences, is able to distinguish between these things. In this is serious, because if somebody were to be deemed a disbeliever, which is from our perspective morally bad, people then assume, okay, they've left Islam, so therefore we can kill this person. And this is where this movement, this takfiri movement has emerged by these people who unfortunately sort of come from the tribe of Islam, that think that because somebody has done something, therefore they have left Islam, they are a kafir or an apostate, a murtad, so we can kill them. And this is why I think we need to talk about it. So let's say that somebody has believed, or somebody is a disbeliever, forget apostasy for now. Somebody is a disbeliever. What is the action that's supposed to be taken? What does the Sharia tell us? The Sharia tells us, you talk to the person. You make sure that they understand what they're saying. You can debate the person. You can argue the person. So on and so forth. But Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. Whoever wants or whoever wills, let them believe. Whoever doesn't, let them not believe. Why is this important? Because Allah Ta'ala also tells us in the Quran, لَا إِكْرَاهَ فِي الدِّينِ. There is no compulsion in religion. Why does God say that? What's the problem with making people believe? Is that it breeds hypocrisy. And hypocrisy morally is the worst thing that we have. It's the lowest level of hellfire, as the Prophet ﷺ said. To state something outwardly, but to believe something differently inward. Or to do something with this group of people, but to do something else with this group of people. Or so on and so forth. Faith and hypocrisy don't mix. So we don't want to make anyone a hypocrite. We don't want to become a hypocrite. If someone believes, they believe. If they don't believe, they don't believe. Because we don't want compulsion to breed hypocrisy. Now what happens when we disagree? We're going to disagree about everything. But we're not going to disagree about the basics, what we call in the language of the Sharia, al-ma'lumu min ad-din bid-darura, things that are necessarily known in religion. Everyone knows that Muslims pray 5 times a day. Everyone knows that Muslims, don't eat this pork or pork products. Everyone knows that Muslims don't drink alcohol. These are what we say necessarily known. But all of the other than these few necessarily known things, we're going to disagree about everything together. That doesn't mean that we disbelieve. That means just we disagree. Because the core things of the faith are things that we all agree upon. Now what happens when people misunderstand that and they say to the other person, oh, this person's a kafir because they don't believe in what I believe, or they don't dress the way I dress, or for whatever nonsense reason, they say the other person is an apostate. The Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا قَالَ الرَّجُلُ لِأَخِيهِ يَا كَافِرْ فَقَدْ بَاءَ بِهَا أَحَدُهُمَا. Agreed upon by Muslim, Bukhari and Muslim, muttafaq alayhi hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, if somebody says to their brother, see the language of the hadith, to their brother, you're a kafir, then one of them has become a kafir. Either this is correct, this person has become a kafir, or the person saying it has left the folds of the faith because they have violated the sanctity of the other person. And that is why the statement of somebody is a kafir is serious, and why the ulama, they say, al-Muslimu sa'b, the Muslim is difficult, meaning that entering into, it's not like it's the mafia, you can't get out of it, but it's very hard to get out of Islam. Like if you're in Islam, it's very easy to get in. But you have to, it's like when they used to tell us in school, you have to actually try to fail. If you just come to class and do half the reading, at least you'll get like a passing grade. You have to work hard to fail. It's like you have to work hard to leave Islam. You have to really want to leave Islam. But like mistakes that people make, general people make, don't take people out of Islam. And because of this, several years ago, there was this large initiative by King Abdullah of Jordan that culminated in what is called the Amman message. And it has 3 points. And one of the points is it tries to criminalize this concept of takfir, the concept of labeling people not a Muslim. Now a lot of you, we giggle and things like that, but why is this serious? Because extremists, extreme Muslims, violent extreme Muslims, they see the world as not Muslim, on purpose. And they see a lot of Muslims as they have left the folds of Islam. And therefore, it is our right to kill them, it is our right to enslave them, it is our right to do what we want with them, because only we are right. And this is where the danger is. The general Muslim community are not people that know the details of the Islamic sciences, do not know the details of the articles of faith, do not know the details of tafsir, of hadith, of the Arabic language, so on and so forth. And that is why they are to be left to themselves, just left the way they are, so we don't make things difficult for them. Not everyone is required to be a scholar. But Imam al-Ghazali, he says something interesting. He says there's a third group of people. You either believe or you don't believe, but there's a third group of people. He says there are people who all they know about Islam are distorted images of Islam. So he postulates, let us say that there's somebody who grows up, their whole life someone tells them, this guy named Muhammad, he's a liar. These Muslims, they're heretics. These Muslims, they're terrorists. These Muslims, they do this. They all from when they're young until they grow up. He said this person is neither a believer, neither a disbeliever, because they have never been given the message of Islam. As a matter of fact, it's even more complicated because they've been given a distorted message of Islam. And Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبَعَثَ رَسُولًا in Surah Al-Isra, and we do not punish anybody until and unless we have given them the message. And this is why, according to the scholars of Ahl Sunnah and the theological schools that entail the Sunni thinking, anybody who has not received the message, or anybody who has received the distorted message of Islam, is saved. They're not a disbeliever. Why? Because disbelief and belief are descriptions, they're not proscriptions. We're not prescribing them on people. They're a description of somebody's state of understanding and state of belief or lack of belief or confused state of belief. Many Muslims themselves, they've received Islam distorted. And because of the proliferation of not just media, but social media and rapid fire media and this type of effect, the amount of miscommunication, the amount of distortion of Islam is unprecedented, in which most people, really most Muslims themselves don't even know what's right from what's wrong. This is the age of confusion that we live in. And the Prophet ﷺ said there will be an age like this. There will be an age of confusion and mass killing. And the person killing won't know why they killed, and the person that got killed doesn't know why they got killed. Just like the age that we live in now. So this is very important that we understand about belief, and just because someone is not a Muslim doesn't mean that you call them a kafir, which is really insulting when you think about it. And belief and disbelief is something that belongs to God alone, to know the true nature of someone's state. Our job is to work on ourselves. كُلُّكُمْ رَاعٍ وَكُلُّكُمْ مَسْعُولٌ عَنْ رَعِيَّتِهِ. And then lastly about slavery. Because these ISIS people, they say that now that the Khilafah is back, we'll talk about the Khilafah next time, but now that the Khilafah is back, we can take slaves. Very interesting that we even have to talk about why we don't have slavery, or why slavery is bad. When the Prophet ﷺ came with the message, and he starts legislating, and he starts teaching people, there were things that already existed. The Prophet ﷺ didn't create slavery. Slavery was already an established thing throughout the world, not just in Arabia at the time. What did the Prophet ﷺ do? He limited slavery. So there are many kinds of slavery. The Prophet ﷺ said there's only one type of slavery that Islam adheres to, which is slavery in war. Why? Because you deal with the enemy the way that they deal with you. That was the thinking. If we fight the enemy and they can take slaves, they need to know that if we fight them, we can take slaves. So that there's equality in battle. When we come and look at all of the statements, this is very important that it's limited. There are other forms of slavery. This is the only type of slavery that if you look at the medieval or formative periods of hadith or fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, this is the only type of slavery that we have. How did the ulama come and catalog these slavery, the rules of slavery? They cataloged them in the section of the legal manual called the Book of Manumission, not the Book of Slavery. What is manumission? Is freeing slaves. In other words, there's no book in Islam called Kitab al-Riq, the book of slavery. It's the book of manumission. It's the book of freeing slaves. Why? Because the whole modus operandi of the Sharia is to free people, not to enslave them. Again, the way the Prophet ﷺ looked at the world, the way that the texts talk about slavery, it's descriptive. There is slavery, therefore it needs to be regulated. Not that you have to take slaves. It's the exact opposite, which is why morally, freeing slaves is considered a great moral act. Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran all the time, وَفَكُّ رَقَبَةً, and free a slave. If you do this sin, the expiation is to free a slave. Why? Because Allah is giving us the opportunity at every moment to free slaves. Not even that, if in the books of fiqh when you read it, and this is why this is very important that we understand that there's a difference between the text, the Quran and the Sunnah, and there's a difference between what we understand from the text. In transaction laws, if I say to you, I'm going to give you my house, kind of like that. I was just joking. But if I said to you, if we lived in the medieval time, I'm going to give you my slave. Or I tell my slave, you're free. Ha ha ha. The judge would make that obligatory that I free the slave. There's no joking when it comes to slavery. Anything that I said, even if it was joking, the slave would be free. And when you look at the sections in manuals of law about slavery, it's all about how you free the slave, when you free the slave, what you need to do to free the slave. Not about how you take a slave. It's about freeing the. What did Abu Bakr do when he went to get Bilal? He freed him. Radiallahu anhu. So the idea of the medieval understanding of slavery is that it needs to be limited because the Sharia wants people to be free, not to be enslaved. And then we come into the 19th century, in which there was a movement, largely by England, to have slavery banned around the world. And the Muslim countries were amongst the first countries to sign these treaties. And Egypt signed the treaty with Britain in 1877 to abolish slavery. And not only that, but the Egyptian government set up offices in different parts of the country, government offices to help slaves earn their freedom and document themselves, so on and so forth. Many people, they think when you say this, that's the government. They don't understand that it was the ulama that were behind these movements to free the slaves. Because of their understanding of the Sharia, not despite their understanding of the Sharia. They said, okay, when you look at all of the things that I just said as a summary of the way they look at slavery, when you look at all of these rules about slavery, the Sharia wants the slave to be free. The Sharia only talks about one kind of slavery. It's a good thing to do morally to free a slave. Now an opportunity has arrived to abolish it once and for all. We're down, because that's what our religion says, not to bring it back. So we've removed slavery, alhamdulillah, for the most part. There are always going to be forms of human trafficking, which is unfortunate and tragic. All those forms of human trafficking are haram. You can't take a free person, a citizen of a country, and make them a slave. This is haram. This is against the Sharia. And I want to conclude with this story that ties the 2 points about apostasy, disbelief, and slavery. Imam Abu Hanifa, he said, let us posit this scenario, that a Muslim owns a slave boy. And then a non-Muslim comes and he says, this slave boy is my son. The Muslim says, well, I bought him. Here's my deed of ownership. So, go away. They take this case to the judge. The Muslim says, the Muslim judge, he says, Judge, this boy is my slave. I bought him for this amount of money, and here is my deed of ownership. The non-Muslim, he says, Judge, this is my boy. And he presents his evidence. What is the judge to do? The issue is, again, medieval thinking, not the issue of the modern period. Medieval thinking. The boy will be with the Muslim owner and most likely will grow up to be a Muslim. If the boy returns to the non-Muslim, he will not be a Muslim. What is the judge to do? How should the judge in this situation? Imam Abu Hanifa, he says, the boy should be returned to his father because the opportunity for freedom here being of not being a slave, outweighs being a Muslim. Because he can always be presented with faith later in life. Because one is free to believe or disbelieve. But the opportunity to become free out of servitude only comes once in life. And he argues that the boy should be given back to his father or his parents and be set free. Because freedom is much more important than belief. This is how the ulama understood the injunctions of the Quran, understood the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. And that's why later the ulama developed these principles of the Sharia, the maqasid of the Sharia. What are the overarching principles that the Sharia tries to aim to establish? And freedom is one of them. So this is what I wanted to talk about today. And with the time, I think maybe there's very little time, but to hear from you if there are any questions or concerns.
Assalamu alaikum. Can I ask, when is it permissible to fight someone who says they're Muslim? You said we could defend our homeland.
When does it say the question again?
When is it permissible, say we join the military? What if we fight other Muslims?
That's a tough question. So joining the military is not something that's compulsory. So it's a choice. So the point that I was trying to make is that one needs to take the type of steps to defend one's homeland. But the military or modern warfare is not very straightforward the way it used to be. It's not like we're going into this one place to do this one thing and leave. There are different types of missions. There are peacekeeping missions. There are, established bases in other places. There are coalition forces. So each, not to skirt around the question, but each situation really needs to be looked at individually. That's sort of what I would say. Each conflict we would have to look at individually. But in general, warfare is something that we should, needless to say, try to avoid at all costs. Especially the modern form of warfare is very damaging, both to the country waging war and the country, the defeated country and the victorious country. It becomes very damaging to society. So the nature of modern warfare has changed, and because of that, the way we think about Islamic injunctions involving war also needs to change, because the point of war in Islam is for a state in Islam is to drive for peace. And I don't necessarily know if modern warfare leads to that. I think modern warfare leads to other things. So the Quranic, paradigm of war is that you fight if it's a legitimate, following certain rules of engagements and things like that. I'm just assuming that right now. You fight in order to establish peace, in order to stop aggression, in order to stop injustice, that kind of thing. So a lot of times, unfortunately, modern warfare, they have many more issues involved, economic issues, geopolitical strategic considerations that might pose a moral issue, and a larger conversation should be had. So I would say. Okay. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh Tarek. I do have a question. So in some of the recent news that we've seen about the actions of ISIS, we've heard a lot about the mistreatment of women, whether in cases where they're not permitted to leave, for example, Raqqa, if they are under the age of 45, or women who are forced to only exit their homes in the company of a guardian. And this is put under the guise of being justified by Islamic text. How would you respond to some of these things happening now?
So the first thing about ISIS is everyone has to understand that this is theater. The people that are in ISIS are acting. They are acting like they are Muslims. They are acting like they are following the Quran and the Sunnah. They are acting scholarly. It's theater. When you go to see a play or you go to watch a movie, it's not real. No matter how intense that experience is, it's not real. These people are acting. This is not real Islam. This is not real injunctions. I want that to be very, very clear. And no matter how much you fake it, you can't make it when it comes to this issue. So they can act all they want. They can say all they want. It's comical because sometimes they try to quote things from the first generation and they'll get like 90% of the quote wrong and they'll mess up on 10%. But because they got 90% and it sounded so like old Arabic, people, the Khalifa said this. It's just a joke. It's a joke. These are not real ulama. These are not real authorities of anything. It's just theater. And that does not change truth one iota. And most likely the ISIS people are not going to watch this, and even if they heard that, they would just, this guy's a kafir anyway. And case in point, and it doesn't matter. But I'm saying this for, the off chance that there's some young person somewhere seeing this, and this will help them understand that this is just theater. This is not piety, this is not Islam. The thing about women, guardians and stuff like that, the Prophet ﷺ said, a time will come in which a woman will be able to travel all the way to Sana'a in Yemen and have nothing to fear. So this is an allusion to that there will be a time in which travel, there is safe passage. So the idea, again, the idea of the rulings of a woman being in need of a companion is not because is this ruling in the books of fiqh, not because there's some sort of weakness or deficiency in the woman, is because travel is not safe. But now that we have safe travel, except in whatever the place you mentioned, that's probably not safe anyway. There is no harm of a woman traveling for any reason, whether it be work or education or anything like that. So these rules do not apply in the current predicament or the current context because there is no harm of traveling. And this is a time that the Prophet ﷺ alluded to that would be a good time, that there will be ability to save. Women in the past, up until sort of the turn of the modern age in the Muslim world, there was a culture of women were secluded from society. And many Orientalists and many reform modernist Muslims, whatever is the right term, they look at this time period as a time period in which women were mistreated or something like that. That's different. That was sort of a societal thing where aristocratic women didn't need to go out because they had people do everything for them. And they had their own sort of life, secluded life, and it was sort of a good life in that sense. That's different, and we should not confuse the two. Because when we look at things in the past, we have to understand it in its context. Not take that out of its context and put it in our context and say that's bad, because that's not fair. And again, that's why these people are theater. They're trying to take something that they misunderstand, that they misquote, that might be a general statement and they want to make it particular, or a particular statement and they want to make it general, and they yank it out of its context and they put it here and you say, look, we're doing God's work. And that's why it's bad theater at that.
More domestic issue. I know there's a lot of attention being drawn to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the author who's bringing a lot of books.
Oh yeah, I wanted to mention her. Thank you for bringing it up.
You're welcome. But how do we coexist with that version of Islam? I mean, I'm not going to call her out on anything she's doing, and I never have a one-on-one with her. But when we have people addressing that to us, how do we say with your eloquence and your intellect?
So you reminded me, I wanted to talk about apostasy. So and then I'll talk about Ayaan Hirsi Ali. So apostasy. A lot of people, they think that if somebody is a Muslim and they leave Islam, you get to kill that person. As funny as it sounds, people actually think that. So I wanted to address that because that's a misunderstanding. And the Prophet ﷺ left many people that had apostated, who had left Islam. But there were apostates in the first generation that were killed. So some people, they think that they were killed because they were apostates. The classical legal view of apostasy is that if apostasy is linked with some sort of national security threat, because at the time Islam was a state and a religion, and if you're like selling secrets to the enemy, then that can be a capital punishment, not because of the apostasy, but because of the harm to national security. And the proof is that the Prophet ﷺ left all of these people that cursed him and that did this and that were hypocrites and all, and he just left them. He didn't kill them. So it's important that we understand what Islam has to say about apostasy. Ayana Hirsa Ali doesn't know anything about anything. She can't speak English, she can't write English, she can't speak Arabic, she can't write Arabic. She's nothing. What she's saying is nothing. It's nonsense. And you know, good, write what you want to write and see what's going to happen. She's not going to get far with what she's saying. Her categories of Muslims is misconstrued. And, you know, this idea, if only the heretics were in charge, everything would be better. I mean, it's ludicrous. I mean, how is somebody like Ayana Hirsa Ali or a heretic in a religion going to reform the religion? It doesn't make anything. You know, so it's like a communist going to fix capitalism and American democracy? No, it's going to be somebody that's within the system. So these things are just comical to me. Whatever, just let her say what she wants, let her do all of the rounds, and as quickly as she's doing the rounds, as quickly she'll get slammed, and you know, people will find that there's just nothing of benefit in what she's saying. I disagree with her. I'm sorry that she had a traumatic childhood. I'm sorry that, you know, her and all of these like refusnik Muslims, I feel bad that they had this experience, which is proof that that type of Islam leads to that outcome, leads people to leaving. All of these ISIS people, when they're defeated, half of them are going to leave religion altogether. Half of them are going to not believe in God. Why? Because they're sitting there being told that they're doing God's work. When they get the hell kicked out of them, and they're all scrambling for some cave, when they have a quiet moment, they'll be like, why didn't God save us? I thought we were, then there's no God. And that's exactly what's going to happen to like half of them, or a large percentage. They will leave belief altogether because that belief system didn't work, and that's the tragedy. So, are there problems with Islam, problems with our understanding of Islam? Absolutely. We need to, you know, do a better job of understanding. We need to do a better job of interpreting. We need to do a better job of understanding what from our tradition we can use, what we need to rethink, you know. That's sort of why this topic, I wanted to talk about it in the first place, to get us to sort of think of you know, how we can just live our life in peace and in harmony with our multiple identities. So I think the general concept of the need to think better, do better is valid. But I think the premise of her reform program is just flawed because the tools she's using is flawed. And you know, if she doesn't want to be a Muslim, that's fine with me. It doesn't make a difference for me, but just then leave Islam alone. You know, why are you obsessed with Islam? I thought you left. Why are you obsessed with it? Just go. Do something else. So, you know, that's sort of her and that ilk. We shouldn't be threatened by that, and, you know, happy to engage with those people. It doesn't really make a difference.
Sheikh Tarek, thank you very much once again for an extremely enlightening discussion. Along the subject of apostasy, I also wanted to ask you about the parallel subject of blasphemy, which has also become a hot topic in the last few years, and it almost seems as if a similar kind of mindset is driving a renewed debate on these kind of issues. The question I want to ask is that as a historian, I note that cases of actually trying someone and finding them guilty for both blasphemy and on takfir are extremely rare historically. But all of a sudden, in the last 3 to 4 years, you're finding an extreme emotion attached to this issue of blasphemy, attached to the issue of apostasy. I was wondering if you could both talk to what whether blasphemy how blasphemy is dealt with in Islamic law, and also if you could also mention why this has become a renewed issue and there's so much ignorance surrounding these topics of blasphemy and apostasy, particularly in the last 3 to 4 years.
How do we deal with blasphemy? We should deal with blasphemy with the way the Prophet ﷺ dealt with it. The companions, they said, they're slandering you, they're making fun of you, shouldn't we do something? And he said, they're making fun of some guy named Mudhammam, but I'm Muhammad. Because Mudhammam in Arabic is the one that's cursed and Muhammad is the one that's praised. So he made fun of them. And like the story of the idols and the Kaaba, what I was trying to say is that the Prophet ﷺ was not dim-witted. Hasha, that we would say that he was very intelligent. He could see beyond, the physical thing that's in front of him. Why has this become an issue? You're right. I actually don't know of any, not that I've read everything, but I don't even remember coming across a case or in the pre-modern period of a court case or something like that in which a qadi talked about blasphemy. Blasphemy obviously is a moral sin, but again, not everything that's morally done that's wrong or sinful, have to take things into our own hand. Has to be a rule of law and courts and things like that, even if we live as minorities, and we have to respect the rule of law. So why has it become popular, or why has it become rampant rather? I think the answer to that is also the answer to many other questions of that ilk of why are we in this situation. And I think that part of it is this idea that the world and the Muslim world has somehow become a world, has somehow become an age of ignorance. And that, this bozo, al-Baghdadi, he says, that Islam has now been established and it hasn't been established in centuries. Well, what does that mean? All of these people are not Muslims? That's ridiculous. Ridiculous that he would even say that. But that's the mentality that breeds this type of thinking, that everyone has left Islam, that there's no real Islam, that I'm the only real Muslim. So, what did you say? A blasphemy. What did you say? Oh, you left Islam. You went out of your house without taking my permission? Like that. This ridiculous Neanderthal attitude. It comes from this idea, and this is where we have to remember our spiritual and our moral teachings, because Islam is not just what we do when we go to court or what you do when you go to the bathroom. Islam is also to refine our humanity. The Prophet ﷺ said, I was only sent to refine character. So there's this idea that there's a sin called arrogance. What is arrogance? That I'm better than you because I'm either taller than you, I'm richer than you, I'm smarter than you, I'm better looking than you. I mean, we know that's not true. But there's this idea that I'm better than you. And it builds up, and people can become arrogant with anything. And when you go to different parts of the world, you find people that they vie with one another to have a special type of license plate on their car, or a special kind of phone, or my key ring is more fancy. It's stupid stuff that doesn't matter. But arrogance is a human problem. These people are arrogant. That's why I said it's theater. It's bad theater. They're acting like they're pious, but they're just full of hatred, and they're full of fear, a literalism that does not allow them to see beyond what has been written. They have no interpretive skills, so on and so forth. So all of these, I really think, come together to make people scared when there's a question. It's okay to question. It's okay to, even as I was with Ayana Hersali and other people like that, it's okay that people have deep issues, because there are deep issues. Maybe that's not the right way to deal with them. That's not the way I would deal with them. But it's natural that people would have problems. So let's sit down and understand it. And the only thing that is, holy, or the only thing that is, untouchable is the Quran and the established traditions of the Prophet ﷺ. But our understanding of those can be flawed, or can be limited, because we're humans. The human trying to understand the infinite, the finite trying to derive meaning from the infinite. Of course we're going to miss the mark and make some mistakes. And just to show that Islam cares about the freedom of expression. All of these opinions we leave in the books. Why do we not get together and burn the books? Let's take out the verses of the Quran that we don't like, and let's have the new standard version of the Quran. Why don't we do that? We leave everything the way it is so we can comment on it, so we can see how people in the past understood it, even if we disagree. We have collections of hadith, of forged hadith. Why? So we remember these are the forged hadith, people. They're in this book. And we reprint them and we comment on them and stuff like that, so we benefit from them. Even when there are aberrant opinions, very funny opinions, very embarrassing opinions, we keep them. Just keeping them doesn't mean that we follow them or we adhere to them. There is a difference between a hadith that's sound and a hadith that's accepted. That's huge. These people can't make that difference. What does that mean? Okay, this hadith is sound, its chain is sound, its meaning is sound, but none of the madhahib took from it. Because they found something not applicable with it. Again, the differentiating mind. There's a difference between the hadith being sound and a difference between I apply the hadith. This level of sophistication requires study, requires training, requires a little bit of natural talent that you have the ability to do that. These people, they don't. So when somebody says something, they automatically want to assume the worst. They automatically want to take things into their own hands. Whereas the ulama, they're like, people say things all the time. They didn't really mean that. That's the attitude that they took. But when another alim writes something horrendous, then they're like, everything goes crazy. And they're like, how could you say that? And they attack him and they make fun of him, all of these things, because he should know better. But when a normal person, sends out a tweet, that's the Islam that they know. They grew up in this, part of the world. That's all they know. All they know is like the dumb mullah. That's, in Arabic cinema, the sheikh is the babbling idiot. That's the character of the sheikh. He's the guy that's not well dressed. No one understands anything that he's saying. You only bring him in when you're doing like the marriage ceremony and that's it. Or he's the Arabic teacher that speaks in such a weird Arabic that the students don't understand. They just make fun of him. That's the character. So people grow, you laugh, but people grow up seeing that that's what the ulama are like. So if that's all you know about Islam, if all you know about Islam is ISIS, if all you know about Islam is, burning this guy and killing this person or throwing this person off the roof, then you are going to be like, these guys are crazy. So this is part of it. The area of debate has withered away. There's no more, it's only me and what I see. And this is sort of where we, I think, go down. Anything else? Okay. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa alam.